Hi there. We're getting into taxes today. Now, I know that's not the most popular of topics, but we're going to be talking specifically about wealth taxes. And a wealth tax? That's a bit of a crowd pleaser. It's seen as a way of closing the gap between rich and poor, reducing inequality while raising revenue. So how come only a few countries have one? Particularly right now, when economic inequality is on the rise and budget deficits are ballooning. What are the pros and cons of a wealth tax? Let's try and find out. I'm Carmel Crimmins, and this is Reuters Econ World. So the reason we're talking about a wealth tax is France. It's got a big financial hole to fill, with the biggest budget deficit in the Eurozone. Some economists think a wealth tax is part of the answer, making the super rich pay an annual levy on their fortunes. But others disagree. They say a wealth tax wouldn't actually raise that much revenue and could have negative, unintended consequences. To try and understand all the arguments around a wealth tax, I got in touch with two reporters who were following every twist and turn of this story. Francesco Canepa is our senior European economics correspondent in Frankfurt, and Leigh is our senior correspondent in Paris. Hey Francesco, hey Leigh.
Hi.
Hi.
Nice to have you on the show.
Great to be here.
Yeah, thanks for inviting me.
So listen, most of our listeners are in the US, right? So 3 Europeans talking about wealth taxes just cements a lot of stereotypes out there for them.
Yeah, I can imagine, yeah.
2 Europeans and 1 American, actually.
Oh, Leigh, you're American?
I am.
But you've been in France a long time?
A very long time.
I get to ask all the rude questions. How long?
25 years, maybe? I don't know. I haven't even added it all up.
So I should rephrase it. 2 Europeans and 1 American talking about wealth tax. 1 American who's lived a long time in France talking about wealth tax just cements a lot of stereotypes for us then. So, actually, Leigh, why don't I start with you? Because you're in the country that's at the centre of it all.
Sure. Well, the situation in France right now is that France has a pretty serious budget hole. And so there's basically 2 ways to solve the problem of what do you do with a big hole in your budget. And that's you cut spending, which obviously is not very popular, or else you raise taxes, which is also not very popular unless you raise taxes on a very small proportion of the population, which happens to be the wealthiest people in the country. And so there is a proposal out here. The left has enthusiastically taken up the idea, a proposal from the French economist Gabriel Zukman for a 2% tax on wealth over 100 million euros.
It's a pretty popular proposal in France.
Indeed it is, yeah. A recent poll suggested that it's about 86% of the people are in favor of that. And that kind of cut across the voting spectrum as well. Even voters for parties that the parties themselves are not actually supporting the tax, their voters apparently are quite in favor. So there is indeed quite a lot of popularity for such a measure.
Now, taxes are definitely used to raise revenue and fill deficits, but there's also a particular kind of a unique aspect to a wealth tax, isn't there, Francesco?
Yeah.
Like it is about closing the gap between the rich and the poor, about reducing inequality.
Absolutely. Over the past 4 decades, that gap has widened. Right now, the top 1% of the pyramid in the United States owns roughly 40% of the country's wealth. In the late 1970s, this was just 20%. So you can see there why inequality is such an important topic for voters and why economists who propose wealth taxes have always find an audience.
Is that a big part of what's driving its popularity in France then, Leigh? Is it the kind of the income redistribution aspect of it, the idea that it will kind of close the gap?
Yeah, it is. Yeah. I mean, Gabriel Zukman, the architect of the proposal in France, his research indicates that the 500 richest families in France pay proportionally less than the average person in France. I believe his figures are something like they pay like 25%, all taxes included, whereas the average person pays something closer to 50%. Now, 50% sounds high, but that's also including things like VAT, sales tax, and that sort of thing. So it's really all in.
Right.
So that resonates with people, when they hear that they are paying twice as much tax as the wealthiest people in the country. That speaks to people. In France, it's important to keep in mind that there is a very sophisticated and extensive redistribution function from the government. And yet at the same time, a lot of people think that they are paying more into the system than they are actually getting out of it, where the actual research from the Statistics Institute in France, the National Statistics Institute, is that no, actually 57% of the people get more from the sort of the welfare state than they actually pay into it. So there is a bit of a misconception of how much people are paying in and paying out.
Wealth taxes are not a new idea, Francesco, right? Like they actually were quite popular in Europe in years gone by. But over the last 10 years or so, countries seem to have abandoned them, right? So there's only a number that have left. What was the problem? What was the issue?
But it's true that in 1990, there were 12 countries in the OECD, so not just Europe, but main economies globally, that had the wealth tax. And now it's down to just 4.
Right.
So Norway, Switzerland, Spain, and Colombia. So what happened? First is that countries found that they were collecting very little in revenue, just a few decimal points of GDP. Why? Well, precisely because there were too many exemptions.
Okay.
And so that the tax base was too narrow. And it was too easy to gain.
There was also a lot of self-reporting as well, wasn't it? People had to declare their wealth, which...
I was about to get...
I'm not a tax collector, but I can see a problem there, right?
Yeah. Well, that's... Ironically, Switzerland has the highest rate in terms of tax collection as a percentage of GDP at over 1% for its own wealth tax. But that's because A, it doesn't have a capital gain tax, so that's its only way of collecting taxes on essentially returns on capital. And B, it's self-reported, so you have to report your own wealth. So the wealthy Swiss are very happy to have that tax, to pay a moderate amount of their wealth every year as tax, rather than having a more intrusive tax on capital gains. Whereas for Spain's wealth tax and for Norway, it is a modest intake at a few decimal points. The other objections to wealth taxes that have essentially caused them to become so unpopular is that first, it is perceived as unfair because you are taxing capital wealth that has already been taxed. And second, that it's hard to implement because while it could be, especially if your banks are forthcoming, relatively easy to tax your securities account, it's much harder to tax like an old painting or antiques. Like having a precise idea of their value is not so easy.
You mentioned it's taxing stuff that's already been taxed before.
Yeah.
Can you explain that?
Well, first of all, the income using which you bought those shares was taxed. Then in many countries, whether you sell or not, you do pay a certain amount of taxes. In Germany, for example, if you do not receive a dividend from your investment, the government still calculates some sort of pro forma dividend and charges some taxes. So essentially that money, if it's not illegal money hiding somewhere, if it's legal money, it has been taxed at least once as income and then again potentially as capital gains.
Right. And if you've bought the diamond ring, you've paid maybe a sales tax on it already. It's that kind of thing, right?
Yes, potentially. Yeah. Anyway, if it's legal money, it will have gone through the machine at least once.
Okay.
Or twice.
Okay.
If it's a company, then the company has already paid, presumably, corporate income tax.
Yes.
And so then as an owner of a company, you then pay a tax on the dividend as well. And then on top of that, a wealth tax. The idea is that it's all coming from the revenue is all coming from the same source, but it's been taxed several times along the way.
And then there's the issue of business assets. If you, like Zukman, wants to consider everything as wealth, then perhaps business assets too. But the capital stock of a company is there for the company to invest at a later stage or to face potential shortfalls. So it's a tricky question how much of a company's assets should be taxed as part of a wealth tax.
Now, one of the big criticisms of wealth taxes is the idea that they can be negative for economic growth.
Yeah.
And so it's kind of like the idea that the prospect of being able to get super rich is what motivates would-be entrepreneurs. And if you make that less likely, then that's bad for growth.
Yeah.
Is there any evidence, Francesco, to suggest that that's what happens when you apply a wealth tax? Or is it just too hard to answer that question because, wealth tax has never been implemented, in the way that economists would like it to be, i.e. with no exemptions?
Yeah, I'd say you're onto something there. Essentially, if you implement it in the way it has, then it's just too narrow for us to be able to draw conclusions. Plus, it's also hard to put your finger on the multiplier effect of wealth on the economy, because people say, billionaires have firepower to invest, they have ideas, they have skills and contacts, they can drive an economy forward. True, but they also typically make their money when they're not billionaires. You have your bright ideas when you're young and hungry. Once you are a billionaire, what you typically do is you extract rent from it. You know the right people. So it's not... Yeah, it is essentially very hard to answer the question if a wealth tax would actively hamper growth. What we can say is that the US is definitely taking a more positive stance on wealth. The president there invites billionaires for dinners, far from taxing them.
Yeah. And
the whole tax code is written in a way which is favorable for the wealthy. So that could be used, I guess, as a counter argument in saying the US economy has performed so well because it has been able to attract all these rich people. Some of the most entrepreneurial people in the world live in the US, and that's not a coincidence, and that's why they have the Silicon Valley, and that's why they have so much capital to invest in the best ideas. That's why AI is happening there and not here. So yeah, that is a valid counter-argument. If you treat capital nicely, maybe capital will be nice back.
Speaking of treating capital nicely, Tesla has proposed a pay package for Elon Musk that could potentially be worth $1 trillion if certain targets are met. One of those targets is around Tesla's market capitalization. So the question is, how big does the company have to get on a market valuation basis before Musk can get his full compensation? Is it A, $5.5 trillion, B, $8.5 trillion, or C, $10.5 trillion? We'll have the answer at the end of the show. Up next, a deep dive into the wealth tax proposal in France and why Switzerland, the place a lot of people stash their wealth, is one of the few countries that does tax people's assets. So talk us through Zukman's proposals, right? So it would be a 2% tax on wealth above 100 million euros, right? And he says it would affect only 1,800 households, but raise up to 20 billion euros annually. Is that right?
Exactly, that's right. Some other economists have questioned whether the revenue would be that high. There's some leading economists have suggested to be probably closer to 5 billion euros. If it's 20 billion, that would be very good for the budget. That would go a long ways towards closing France's budget hole, at least in 2026.
What's the reason for that discrepancy? Because he's saying 20 billion and then other economists are saying 5 billion. What's the reason? What's behind that difference?
Well, I think it's because nobody really knows until it's actually enacted how much it's going to raise. Because one of the problems with this is we don't actually know how much wealth people have. It's not like income. It's not like when you file your income tax that it's pretty clear how much people have earned. Their companies say how much they've earned. But whereas wealth is much more complicated and it can be spread out in a number of different countries and things like that. So we don't necessarily have a really clear idea of the tax base that this tax is going to be built on.
And when they say wealth, does he mean everything? Does he mean stocks, shares, property, diamond rings, old masters' paintings? How does he define wealth?
He defines wealth as everything. And that's
right.
Part of the point is France actually had a wealth tax at a very lower level. It was only, I think it was at 1.3 million euros. But it had a lot of exceptions and exemptions and things like that. And the tax rate was much, much lower. And Emmanuel Macron, the president, when he came to office in 2017, he reduced it to only cover real estate.
Right.
And Zukman says that you've really got to make it your tax simple without any exemptions or things like that, or otherwise people will just game the system. They'll hire an army of lawyers and tax specialists who will find the loopholes and all of that, and they'll find a way out of it. And so You really have to keep it simple, in his view, to ensure that doesn't happen. But then there is quite a big debate in France because there's a lot of people that say, well, business owner, I own a big company or something like that, but I don't necessarily have enough revenue to be able to free cash to be able to pay 10% of my 2% of my wealth each year. And Zukman says, well, too bad.
Right.
Basically.
A big criticism of wealth taxes is that money or capital is mobile. So if you tax the rich, they'll leave.
When people say that capital is mobile, they like to think about wealthy people upping sticks and leaving their country. But that doesn't even have to happen, because there are a million different tricks that people will sooner deploy than actually leaving the country, where they have their family, their friends, their businesses, their connections.
So is there any evidence that people do leave?
If we have to put our finger on one solid conclusion, so that people will sooner use accounting changes rather than actually physically leave the country, right? There's some evidence of people moving within the country when tax rates vary between regions. That happened in Switzerland and in Spain.
Okay.
But even there, it was a secondary factor when compared to changes made to capital allocation, so buying exempted assets as opposed to assets which are taxed. The one country that stands out is Norway. So there, people have come to expect it. It's culturally entrenched, it's part of the national ethos. And there you can see that the wealthy have generally moved out of the country because they know the wealth tax is there to stay. And
where do they go?
Switzerland, the United States, the UK. Or if they do stay, they tend to gift some of their wealth to their kids to kind of spread the tax burden as much as they can.
Switzerland is interesting. It is surprising, isn't it, to read that Switzerland has a wealth tax, because you associate Switzerland as a place that capital certainly moves to and that rich people move to, avoid paying tax. There's a deep irony there.
Yeah, but Switzerland treats the wealthy very, very respectfully. First of all, there is no tax on capital gains. So essentially, the wealth tax is the only way in which Switzerland taxes capital. And second, wealth is self-reported. So the wealthy are probably happy to pay a little bit of their wealth every year in a wealth tax and avoid a more intrusive look into their assets. They can easily self-report their assets, which, is a big advantage.
Culture plays a big role in all of this, right?
Taxes are deeply cultural. So in a country like Norway, they are part of the national ethos. And even if they were controversial, and the Labour Party, which supports it, won the last election since a few weeks ago. And even though the tax rate was raised in 2022, and there was some outrage at that, still most Norwegians obviously support it. The French are obviously not entirely against it. And even the Brits had a conversation about it, even though that seems to have kind of quietened down a little.
Yeah.
In Italy, it comes back in waves. Every time there is a bit of a deficit problem, a wealth tax is normally discussed, or at least raised as a spectre, as some sort of boogeyman to keep parties on the straight and narrow. And in Spain, when the debt crisis erupted in the early 2010s, a wealth tax was imposed. It was meant to be for a limited period of time, but it still exists. And actually a floor was put recently. So deeply cultural. In the US, which is obviously the country of capitalism, or at least the US likes to think of themselves as the country of capitalism. Maybe that just wouldn't fly. But it's true that Elizabeth Warren made that.
She did. Back in 2019, she proposed a billionaire tax.
Yes.
It obviously didn't go anywhere.
And Joe Biden as well. It was in his budget, but it got dropped out of the budget because there was no way it was going to get passed in Congress.
Yeah.
I mean, Leigh, could you ever see it happening in the US, a wealth tax?
The way things are right now, I don't see that happening. Who knows in 5 years what the US will look like.
I hope you're enjoying this show. If you like hearing about the latest trends in business and finance, check out the podcasts produced by the commentary team at Reuters, Breaking Views. You can find their shows, The Big View and The Viewsroom, on the Reuters app. Just search for media and then podcasts. You can also find them on your favourite podcast platform. Stay tuned to hear how the super rich move their fortunes around in the most tax-efficient manner. Tell me the ways in which capital is mobile. Tell me the ways in which the super wealthy can avoid a wealth tax. Francesco, you're leafing through your papers. You've got...
Yeah, exactly. That is right.
The book of evidence is large. Hit us with it. All legal means, of course. I mean, the illegal means that's a whole different podcast.
Yeah, exactly.
I'll take a stab at it.
Go on, Leigh, yeah?
most countries base taxation on where a person is a resident.
Right.
The United States being one big exception on that. It's based on whether you're a citizen. So you can be taxed anywhere in the world if you're a U.S. citizen by good old Uncle Sam. But so a lot of times for other countries, citizens of other countries, they just need to change their tax residency and they are no longer liable. Maybe if they leave assets behind in the country, then those assets might still be liable to taxation. But if they take them with them, then not necessarily. In Gabriel Zukman's proposal is that there would be actually an exit tax on French tax residents who leave France to, more friendly locations. And the idea would be that they would still be on the hook for taxes in France for at least another 5 years, that they would have to pay no matter where they are in the world.
So what are the tricks, if I can put it like that, the legal accounting tricks that the ultra-rich can use to avoid paying wealth taxes, Francesco?
These range from allocating their assets to their business, because business assets are often exempted. They can buy exempted assets, such as heritage sites, forestry, antiques, and they report the value of a hard-to-value assets, as works of art, for example.
Yeah.
And then there are the tax havens. Not all countries are forthcoming when you ask them about who has assets in there. Our US audience may be more familiar with the buy, borrow, die scheme, whereby very rich people buy assets. They can be, for example, shares or shares in their company if they already own one, borrow against them using their private bankers to do so, and live off of that loan. So they essentially don't need an income as such because they live off loans which are obviously tax-free. This means that, again, they don't pay taxes on income, and then they just leave a whole lot of shares in inheritance to their kids, which, again, where the capital gains are not taxed fully because of the step-up system, whereby essentially capital gains are not fully taxed upon inheritance. So that's the way that perhaps very rich people in the US live. In Europe, it's less common because there are inheritance taxes.
Yeah.
In Europe, what people do is create foundations and other entities which are typically tax exempt, which is why rich Europeans are very charitable and they invariably own a foundation, a charity, or some such structure that is essentially tax-free.
Or a forest.
Or a forest, of course, yes. If they're
It is interestingly, isn't it? Like, as an American in France, you'd wonder why countries don't take a leaf out of Uncle Sam's book, though, and sort of tax their citizens no matter where they are in the world. That hasn't been raised as a possibility in France?
It hasn't been raised because not all the countries have the capacity of the United States to tax their citizens all around the world. And frankly, the US probably doesn't do a very good job of taxing all of its citizens who are potentially liable abroad as well. It's a huge task. Most tax offices just don't have the resources to know where assets are scattered around the world.
So what are the other taxes, the ones considered as like good alternatives to a wealth tax, in terms of tackling inequality?
Economists think that a well-designed inheritance tax is fairer. This is because the recipient, the heir, hasn't really worked for it. So it's a windfall for them.
Right.
And also, an inheritance tax does not discourage the middle class from saving for their old age or for building a small nest for their children if the threshold for inheritance is set high enough. Also, for the inheritance tax too needs to be designed well, because right now, for example, in Europe, there are lots of loopholes. For example, you don't fully pay capital gain taxes upon inheritance, or lots of more favorable rates for children, for spouses. So that too is a way of kind of dodging it for lots of people.
So the inheritance tax proposal, like, that's interesting because we're at a stage now as the kind of the baby boomer generation passes on.
Yes.
There's a big transfer of wealth going on.
Yes.
And, it has led some people to worry about, society shifting, certainly in rich countries, from a meritocracy to an inheritocracy, right? So are we seeing signs of countries, those rich countries where there is that big transfer of wealth? Are governments tackling that issue? Are they looking again at inheritance tax?
Well, not that I'm aware of, but an interesting point is that inheritance can, for the middle class, be a driver of equality.
Huh.
I mean, I'm not talking about the very rich here, but if a middle class person, a wage earner, inherits, for example, a flat or a house they can live in, they are going to be a little bit better off and therefore reduce the gap that there is between them and the upper class and the elite compared to a situation in which they will be renting for the rest of their lives. So essentially, this cliff edge that you just described, whereby a whole generation is going to slowly, of course, buy out and leave some assets in inheritance, could be too a driver of equality.
What about other types of taxes?
Going after capital gains in a more serious way, because in pretty much every OECD country, capital is taxed less than labor. That is, the average tax rate on, for example, dividends or capital gains is much, much, much lower than the average tax rate on income. There are maybe reasons for that, which is that you want to incentivize saving and investment, but you can also do that while reducing that gap, which in some countries goes into the tens of percentage points.
I'm delighted you're sticking with me on this conversation all about tax. If you want to dive deeper into markets and the economy, check out Reuters Open Interest on Reuters.com and the Reuters app. It's a hub for data-driven expert commentary on market and economy trends. In the final part of the show, we look at the options for France. As financial journalists, is it hard reporting on this topic, on a wealth tax? Like, it's very loaded, isn't it? People come at it with their preconceptions, right?
I mean, yeah. Essentially, it depends who you speak to, you get completely different readout. What's your take, Leigh?
Yeah, no, it's surprising how much the subject resonates with people. It really strikes a nerve in a way that other things don't. Tax affects everybody. Obviously, everybody has to pay it. And the idea that the richest people in the country would be paying less than most of us, that really hits a nerve.
Yeah. But it's interesting, like, even that you had the Zukman proposal and then you had an open letter from other economists, like within the economics community as well, right? There's quite a cleavage, isn't there?
Indeed, yeah. It's sort of all of the economic community in France is really dividing into two sides, those in favor and those who say, whoa, hold on a second, let's look at this carefully. Maybe we need to do something, but let's make sure that we construct it in a way that doesn't have unintended consequence.
There's no guarantee that Zukman's proposals will ever be passed into law, right?
There's even some people on the left, like the socialists, that kind of recognize that maybe the Zukman tax reaches too far and also would be too difficult to implement, because there are some real concerns that it would not pass muster in the Constitutional Court, because there is some legal precedence that against taxes that sort of single out certain groups of taxpayers. That under the French Constitution you're not really supposed to do. So yeah, I kind of suspect that there will be some watered down version that ends up in the final budget of 2026, but who knows?
So even if the Zukman proposals aren't the ones that go forward, I mean, basically, wealthy French people are going to be facing more tax in some way, shape, or form. Is that the expectation?
Yes, it is. Yes. Yeah. I think that would be hard to avoid at this point.
So what sort of taxes can they expect?
Well, we're not really at the stage where alternatives are being put on the table, because we're still trying to figure out whether the Zukman tax as such will be on the table. But some of the ideas are maybe lowering the threshold from 100 million down to a lower level, but also lowering the tax, the actual, from 2% to, 1% or something like that, so that you would catch a wider group of people. And then that might get you past the Constitutional Court that would have problems with the Zukman proposal. But, we'll just have to see. The French have an incredible capacity for inventiveness when it comes to taxation. They were the first to invent the VAT tax in, I believe, early 1950s. And a common complaint of businesses in France is that the tax code is constantly changing here. So, who knows? Well, I'm sure they'll find some sort of a solution.
A big thank you to Francesco and Leigh for their time and insights. You can catch their great work on Reuters.com and the Reuters app. Now for that $1 trillion quiz question. I asked you, which market capitalization target does Tesla have to reach before Elon Musk potentially gets his trillion-dollar payout? Is it A, $5.5 trillion, B, $8.5 trillion, or C, $10.5 trillion? And the answer is B, a mere $8.5 trillion. This is Reuters Econ World. Every week we go deep on the economic principles and ideas driving the biggest news around the world. If you want to tell us what you thought of this week's show, drop us a line in the comments section of your favourite podcast platform. You can also reach out to me on LinkedIn. Sound design, music composition and engineering on this episode was by Alex Summer. Our podcast team includes Kim Vanell, Tara Oakes, Gail Issa, Christopher Waljasper, Jonah Green, David Spencer, Abisoye Adelusi and Sharon Reich-Garson. Our executive producer is Vila de Kretzer. Remember, for all your daily news, check out our weekday show, Reuters World News. You can catch it on the Reuters app or wherever you listen to your podcast.